Can't tell if I'm live or not, so let's see if I can see this showing up on my YouTube. I'm trying something new. Can't tell if I'm live or not, so. Alright, I'm up. I'm live. See this showing up on my YouTube. I'm trying something new. Alright, everybody. Welcome to a streamed edition of Ron's Library and Ideas. Now it says I'm live, but I can't see it in my YouTube studio. But I'm in here. I think it's important that we give honor to our ancestors, the people who survived, in order for us to make it possible for us to be here right now. And part of that honoring them, giving respect to them, is knowing exactly what they went through. Now I know there is certain limits to where you can't experience what they went through, but listening to their stories, listen to the people who went and did the research, you have a better idea. Get some chapstick. Baby. Well, I get to say, hold on, chat. All right. Sorry about that. Had to get some water. Let's see. I notice people get real uncomfortable when you want to talk about slavery, specifically slavery in America. People don't like being having a mirror held up to them so they can see this is what happened, this is what your ancestors did. And I can understand that, but I'm not worried about those people who don't want to know. This is for the people who do want to know. So we're going to be going through this book called, The Delectable Negro by Vincent Woodard. Now there's another live that I did on my channel. It's been like 6 or 7 months ago, and it got a pretty good reception. So now I'm going to go through because I see people want to know about this. And if you don't have this book, or you're not into reading, I want to be able to present these ideas to you so you can know what's going on. So it's called The Delectable Negro: Human Consumption and Homoeroticism Within U.S. Slave Culture. Now, we always hear about slaves getting whipped, different types of torture, back-breaking labor, sun up to sundown, the sexual assaults that happen. We hear about all of that, but I didn't know they were actually eating us on these plantations as well. That was news to me. Shout out to Tariq Nasheed for even letting me know that this book exists. And shout out to the brother Vincent Woodard for doing the work and learning all this stuff. I know it had to be heavy, just hearing about the horrors that our ancestors faced. And if you want to think about it as like, what's the good that came out of that? Well, you're the good that came out of that. All of us that are here right now. Because just how coal has to go through heat and pressure to be turned into a diamond, the heat and pressure of slavery has molded us into something that has unlimited potential. No one else on the planet has ever gone through what we have gone through. That's in our genetics. And there's something that's going to come from that. But part of that awakening is us learning more about it. So, let's start with this introduction. And I'll be adding my commentary in. And if you have any questions, if you're watching this on the replay, leave it in the comments. If you're watching it live, type it in the chat. All right, this is the introduction. And it starts off with a quote. Master, eated me when I was meat. End quote. In the summer of 2007, so I'm a year out of high school at this point, I visited Somerset Place in Crestwell, North Carolina. At one point, Somerset Place, a historically restored plantation, was the most successful plantation in North Carolina, and its owner, Josiah Collins III, one of the largest slaveholders in the state. It is now a state historic site It is now a state historic site sitting on over 100 acres of lush forest and wetland. My party and I arrived early one Saturday morning, parked near the overseer's quarters, and walked the red cobblestone road down the center of the plantation, past the stocks, past the smokehouse, past the outside cooking facilities, to the gift shop where the tour begins. My travel companions browsed the bookstore while I sat in the adjourned seating area, taking in the genealogy of enslaved persons who had formerly lived on the plantation. Someone had conveniently mounted photographs and biographies of these persons on the walls. There was Darius Bennett, a Somerset field hand who had heard the cannons signaling the Civil War. There was Betsy Spurrell, Riddick, seated with hands folded before a wooden shack. There was even a makeshift family tree dating back to the first enslaved Africans to arrive on Somerset Plantation. After a while, all of us there for the morning. Something just happened. Okay. All of us there for the morning tour made our way into the seating area where our tour guide finally came in and stood before us. He wore khaki pants, a maroon polo shirt, and glasses. He was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and stood about 6'3". For the sake of discussion, I will refer to him as Mr. Swellfellow, because he had that look of a good hometown guy. He probably lived in the same neighborhood as his mother, if not with his mother, volunteered on the local fire department, had a high school sweetheart he was engaged to, went to church every Sunday, and, as far as I could see, wore honesty about his face like a child wears a milky mustache. He was totally disarming and chubby and southern and immediately attentive, standing before us leaning on the mantle of the fireplace. After warming to us, he began by talking about the pictures on the wall and quickly segged into minor details about the plantation. Not all of the original buildings had been restored to the plantation. This was a walking tour that would begin at the overseer's quarters and end at the big house. A woman who had once tried to escape was put in the stocks in the wintertime. Her legs froze and they had to be amputated. Each month, enslaved adults received a ration of a peck of corn and 3 pounds of dried meat. Quote, "The slaves on this plantation were well fed," Mr. Swellfellow emphasized. before rattling off more details about the tour. I tried to stay focused, but my mind returned to the rationed meat and cornmeal. The fact that hard field labor would have depleted such rations in a week, and the image of happy, well-fed darkies ever so casually introduced into Mr. Swellfellow's presentation. I raised my hand and waited for Mr. Swellfellow to call on me. True to his namesake, Mr. Swellfellow noticed my hand and welcomed my question. Mr. Swellfellow, I began, you said that the enslaved were giving a peck of corn and 3 pounds of meat, and then you said that they were well fed. But to my thinking, the enslaved must have gone hungry, especially those working in the fields who would have needed more substance than this to sustain them in backbreaking day-long labor. The smile on Mr. Swellfellow's face dimmed a little, even as he formulated an entirely hopeful response. The slaves were well fed, he insisted. It was not in the economic interest of the master to starve them, and besides, the Collinses were kind and had benevolent relations with their slaves. They weren't the type to make their slaves go hungry. Actually, Mr. Swellfellow, I interrupted, it was in the economic interest of slave masters to starve their slaves. This fact is well documented in literature written by fugitive slaves. And on the subject of kindness, the so-called kindness of masters hardly ever, to my knowledge, interfered with their profit motive. What better way to profit than by giving your slaves minimal nourishment while you expect in return for investment maximum labor output? Only after I stopped speaking did I realize I was shaking internally and had taken an edge to my voice. I became aware of my African American travel companions sitting across the room and a few other white tourists who were part of our morning party. Mr. Swellfellow had flushed and had begun to sweat. He had become anxious and nervous. Clearly, his National Park Service tour guide training had not prepared him to deal in a knowledgeable manner with questions of hunger and starvation on the plantation. Perhaps, too, he felt embarrassed at his immediately defensive posture, embarrassed at his rushings to defend the master, and finally, embarrassed and angry at my daring to challenge what was clearly a sacred memory. Contented, well-fed blacks roaming about the plantation. Tamu, peace. Thanks for tuning in. Now think about that. In this tour guide's mind, the slaves were happy and well-fed and content. And to a lot of people with, a misguided view of slavery, they really think that, oh, no, those were the good old days. The darkies knew their place, and it was a white man's paradise. They thought we were all on the plantation, getting along, didn't have much to do besides work. The master was making all the decisions for us. Y'all should have been happy. This is the mentality that some of them have. So when the author, Vincent Woodard, challenged his notion, he immediately got defensive. And that's one of those things that happens. Like, you get defensive when somebody challenges something that the ego steps forward. But that's a wild thing to think about, that in his mind, no, these niggas was well fed. What you talking about? That's why it's important to know your history for yourself, and don't let your enemy tell you, because they'll lie to you and may not even know that they're lying. Continuing. Needless to say, this initial interaction with Mr. Swellfellow set the tone for the remainder of the tour. When, during the walking tour, he brought up the subject of enslaved persons stealing meat from the smokehouse, I responded by asking why such well-fed persons would have provocation to steal meat in the first place. At one point, thoroughly frustrated with the constant reinforcement of the pastoral and goodly nature of life on Somerset plantation, I said to our tour guide so that everyone could hear, "Mr. Swellfellow, it seems to me that you in the state of North Carolina are invested in an image of the masters as goodly, and that you are not willing to entertain perspectives of plantation life that go against this reality." Swellfellow, sweating even more profusely, denied my accusations and did his best to avoid me the remainder of the tour. Great question for him to bring up. So if the slaves were so well fed, why were they stealing meat? And I can imagine in his mind, he's saying, well, it's because you niggas like to steal. Stereotypes. In this country, they automatically assume the worst about us. Called the child a nigger on the playground. Maybe I should say the N-word so this doesn't get censored by YouTube. And there was somebody recording and he asked her about it, yo, why'd you say that? And she just had a nasty attitude. Anyway, so they found her information, found out where she works, all that good stuff. And now she's set up like a something that's like a GoFundMe because she doesn't feel safe anymore. And she thinks she's going to have to move. And I believe she's raised like $250,000. People sending in money. And in her description, she said, I called the child what he was acting like. Isn't that interesting? You know, it's funny to me when I hear people say racism is only a problem because we keep bringing it up. Clearly, we know that's not the case. But one of the keys of white supremacy is gaslighting. They have to say, oh, no, we're not doing that. What you talking about? They have to make it seem like you're crazy and just constantly complaining. But a key thing I want us to remember, if they were so much superior to us, if they were indeed the supreme beings on the planet, then why do they need a system of white supremacy designed to constantly keep a foot on our collective necks? It's like a handicap system. If that wasn't in place, what would society look like? Excuse me. And that's something for you to think about. But I know that they know that if this system wasn't in place, then we would naturally rise back to our natural position. It's like when you send kids off to school, most of the children I've ever seen coming from good environments, they're excited to learn. They like that. They love learning. They have an interest in experiencing new things. But something happens after we send them off to school. They begin to lose that curiosity. I believe, I'm of the opinion that that's what has happened with us under this system of white supremacy. Something is fundamentally changed within us as we go through this system, and we have to get it back. We have to remember who we are. So let's continue. The history of slavery continues to have meaning in the 20th century. It burdens all of American history and is incorporated into public interpretations of the past, writes James Oliver Horton and Lewis E. Horton. We need look only as far as Somerset Place for an example of a historically laden and contested site of slavery memory. There we see the circumstances of slave existence and the meaning of the master's authority and goodwill as fluid, contested categories of experience regulated by the state and the larger master narrative of slave history. Similar issues regarding the meaning and import of slavery have affected contemporary battlefields and Civil War sites operated by the National Park Service. As a result of pressure from Civil War heritage interest groups, those who give tours at these sites do not speak of slavery as the major social phenomenon that catalyzed the Civil War. Isn't that interesting? They don't want you to think that slavery was the reason why the Civil War started. It must have been something else. Let me get this out of here. Now, where was I? In higher education, another state-regulated realm, the history of slavery continues to shape our lives. A good example of this is Brown University. Brown, like a number of universities on the East Coast, has ties to slavery that trace back to its founder, John Brown. Members of Brown's educational community who have attempted to reconcile the university's historic and economic ties with the institution of slavery have, in the process, encountered staunch resistance from the regents and alumni, among other constituencies. From contemporary debates over national identity to concerns about modern civil rights, the legacy of slavery continues to inform and impact our sense of civic belonging and investment in this experiment called the United States. Living as we do, in a society in which many still deny the fundamental tie between the Civil War and slavery, helps me better understand on a systemic level Mr. Swellfellow's resistance to my insinuations of institutionalized hunger on the Somerset plantation. An admission of institutionalized hunger on the plantation would have required Mr. Swellfellow to alter his notions of the goodly, altruistic master. As well, such an allowance would have required that Mr. Swellfellow consider how sentimental conventions, Christian morals and values, Southern state formation and statecraft all informed our discussion of slaves made to hunger on the plantation. While Mr. Swellfellow had his own geographically bounded, he was from the surrounding area, and personal reasons for denying the existence of slave hunger, my insistence upon the topic arose mostly from the researching for and writing of this book. I had come to know through my research that instances of hunger within such a pristine, well-kept context were often only indicators of a much larger culture of institutionalized hunger. I had encountered numerous masters like Somerset's Josiah Collins III, who one biographer described as, quote, an autocrat with a will as imperious and a sway as absolute as the Tsar himself, end quote. Josiah III, I would find out months after my plantation tour, fit the profile of the cultivated, overlording type of master who used hunger and all manner of social conditioning to wring from enslaved people maximum labor to instill in these persons fear and self-denial. Hunger, with persons such as Collins, was only often the tip of the iceberg. So much more than hunger was at stake in my interactions with Mr. Swellfellow. If he and I could not talk about hunger on the plantation, then we would never, as individuals or a nation, be able to talk about other intersecting issues such as social consumption, ritualized hunger, and cannibalistic masters, populating southern plantations such as Somerset Place. For my part, my encounters at Somerset Place disturbed me and catalyzed in me a state of personal and intellectual reflection. Was the nation, not to mention the state of North Carolina, ready for an open and inquiring discussion into the topics of hunger and human consumption on the plantation? Was I ready to and capable of serving as mediator of this discussion, which clearly had a life beyond the book pages I had labored to fill over the years? In the 19th century, none but the most radical none but the most radical abolitionists believed the enslaved person's claims about consuming masters and their descriptions of a culture of human consumption pervading plantation life. Over a century later, not much has changed. Not only have we collectively forgotten many of the significant details of slavery that continue to impact the present, but we had also willed ourselves to forget the horrific forms that human hunger and the pursuit of power could take. Despite our will to forget and desire to reconfigure the past, the reality is that institutionalized hunger and practices of human consumption characterized by life on many southern plantations. No topic disturbed and mystified 19th century America like the subject of human consumption under slavery. For the most part, whites during the time responded to this topic, as did Mr. Swellfellow, with an air of secrecy and shame. For example, one of the most notorious incidents of literal black consumption from the 19th century involved members of the whaling ship Essex, which sailed from Nantucket, Massachusetts in 1838. White Nantucketers still today have little to say about the incident, especially the fact that the first 4 crew members to be murdered and eaten by whites were black. Nantucket was known in the 19th century as a Quaker and abolitionist stronghold, and its residents then and still today find it hard to explain ship captains operating as slave drivers. African persons treated in a brutish manner aboard whaling ships, and more poignantly, the master-slave ideology informing the consumption of the 4 black men. That's a difficult thing for them to have to admit to. If you look at depictions of Africa today and Africa in the past, when it's depicted by white people, they like to show us like a bone going through our nose, a plate in the lip, and us as cannibals. I've seen those images of like black people looking like looking very primitive, having a big pot in, cooking the poor white explorer and his woman in a big pot, boiling them so they can be consumed. How interesting it is to find that this was going on amongst so-called civilized people, but they were doing it to us. I know this may be a difficult thing for us to get through, and almost like to not get overwhelmed by it. It's like I almost have to detach myself from it, just to keep myself from being like overly pissed off. Because it is one of those things, like you think about all those horrors that the people who were responsible for me being here had to go through. It's enough to make you angry. It's enough to make you furious. But that's part of the healing process. We have to understand these things and work through them. Speak about them. Because before I've heard of this book, The Delectable Negro, I never knew. Let's see if I can get it to focus. I never realized that this was something that went on. There we go. Check this book out for yourself. Or keep coming back to the channel. We'll discuss it. All right, it took me a while to figure out this streaming software stuff. And I got to get up and go to work in the morning. So we'll continue this later on. Thank you for those who have tuned in. Thank you for those who are going to tune in the future. Make sure you hit the like button, share, leave some comments. Let me know what you think. Also on my channel, fellas and ladies, I'm reading something called The Way of the Superior Man by David Dita. There's a playlist that you can find on my channel that's going to have up to chapter like 33 on there so far as of this recording. I'm invested in bringing out the best version of myself. And while I'm doing that, I want to help other people out along the way. There's a lot of great information in the book, so make sure you check that out. Ladies, you need to know what a superior man truly looks like, not what toxic masculinity looks like, or a lack of masculinity. So y'all should listen and share this as well. Make sure you check out my ebook, Free Your Mind to Have Peace of Mind, 7 Practices for Supreme Peace by Ronald Simmons. That is an ebook. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see y'all on the next episode of Ron's Library and Ideas. Peace.